Hello, this is Eric Weirson from Newsweek magazine. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where the World Bank and the IMF are holding their annual spring meeting. I sat down with the former president of Colombia, Ivan Duque, and I wanted to ask him about how Latin America is looking at the U.S. political election. Also, we talked about a range of issues affecting Latin America, from Venezuela to the immigration crisis on the border. Here's what he had to say. Mr. President, thanks for sitting down with Newsweek magazine.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a great honor to be here.
The first thing I want to talk about are the U.S. political elections. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the division in this country, but how is this election being seen through the eyes of the region? And how are Latin Americans, particularly Latin American leaders, looking at this dynamic between the possibility of having a second Trump term or having a second Biden term?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of anxiety, and maybe there's a lot of uncertainty. People want to know how is the policy with Latin America going to evolve in the years to come. But what I can tell you, at least from the Colombian perspective, is that what has been successful so far has been that the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia is that it has been bipartisan and bicameral over the years, which allows the country to have long-term state policies with the United States and at the same time guarantee that those policies are not going to have an abrupt shift depending on what the outcome of the election is. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. And I believe Latin America has a very important strategic role to play in the years to come, not only in energy supplies, in food security, but at the same time being a real place for nearshoring and friendshoring. So I believe there's a great momentum that, if it's bipartisan and bicameral, can only bring progress to the region.
Now, you had the opportunity, I believe, when you were president, to work both with President Trump and with President Biden. Certainly, you got to see that up close. What do you think are some of the differences in terms of how the U.S. foreign policy might play out depending on who takes the mantle in the years to come?
I actually enjoy the bipartisanship and bicameralism of the strategic relationship between the U.S. and Colombia. During President Trump's administration, we had a strong support in the migration crisis that we suffered from migrants coming in massive numbers to Colombia from Venezuela. But we were able to build one of the best social responses ever done in Latin America, where we create a temporary protection status for 10 years for almost 2 million Venezuelans, and we got a strong support.
You know, in this country, there's this deep polarization. I think we saw a lot of that also play out in Brazil in recent years. How do you see that polarization? Is that something you think that's unique on a country by country, or is that you think that's something that's happening on a more regional basis?
Moises Naim, who's one of the top analysts on global affairs from Latin America, published a book where he talks about 3 Ps, and he talks about populism. He talks about post-truth, and he talks about polarization. Those 3 Ps are enemies of democracy. And you see those trends not only in the global south, you also see it in the global north. We are living in polarized times, we're living in post-truth times, and we're also living in times of tremendous populism, where many people just want to have more likes than ideas sometimes. More people just want to create or trigger battles that are social battles, class battles, or even message battles. And I think we might be also weakening our democratic institutions. And why? Because as post-truth keeps on winning space, it's destroying the essence of democracy, which is the liberty to choose based on sound information. So this year, we're going to have more people than any other year in world history coming out to the ballots and electing officials in times of those 3 Ps. And I think we have to monitor closely that democracy is not weakening. And I tend to believe that today we're having a democratic deficit. When you look at the whole world population, almost 6 out of 10 people are being governed in autocratic regimes. And the sad story is that maybe a decade ago it was 48%. So we cannot take democracy for granted. We need to keep on protecting democracy, but democracy in the essence of being the liberty to choose.
Now, Mr. President, you mentioned a little bit about the Venezuelan immigration crisis in Colombia, and obviously the U.S. has its own immigration challenges at the border, and frankly, a lot of that immigration historically has obviously been Mexican and Central American, but increasing, there's more and more Venezuelan migrants. So I want to turn our focus right now to Venezuela. Venezuela is creating a lot of tumult in the region. You want to talk a little bit about how you see Venezuela in the current context?
Well, I'm worried that the dictatorial regime of Nicolas Maduro is again playing the same old tricks. He had a negotiation table. He had the U.S. as a guarantor of that negotiation table with the democratic resistance. He offered free and trustworthy elections, as he also requested the reduction of some of the sanctions or the elimination of sanctions, and maybe having back one of his top aides called Alex Saab, who was his main money launderer, and also the lowering of sanctions against some of his narco nephews that were involved in transnational crime. And what you can tell is that, yes, there has been a lot of progress in favor of Maduro, because he had got back the possibility of having more oil exploration again.
Do you think he hoodwinked his U.S.
Well,
counterparts?
I think he tried to con the U.S., and I'm happy to see that now it looks imminent that the U.S. is reestablishing the sanctions. I think those sanctions needs to be reinstated, just because Maduro not only did not fulfill what he promised, but he actually denied the possibility of the person that represents the democratic resistance to be a candidate, and her name is Maria Corina Machado. So he banned her for running, he banned her substitute for running, and he only wants to have puppets in the ballots battling his own sentiment of keeping power.
But do you think that the sanctions really make much of a difference? I mean, they're kind of an awkward instrument of foreign policy, right? Because they tend to almost make the dictator in every country stronger, right?
Well, you know, sanctions don't necessarily, by day overnight, can take out dictators from power, but they are a moral duty. Because if you don't have sanctions against those criminals against humanity and those people who are destroying their countries, where at some level, if you don't have those sanctions, you're recognizing them as genuine representatives of that country.
But you're disproportionately affecting the population at the base, right?
Not necessarily, because if the sanctions are well focused, and that's why most of the sanctions that we saw in Venezuela were targeted specifically at Nicolás Maduro, who has also been indicted by the U.S. Judicial system. Many of his cronies inside his illegal narco apparatus have also been targeted by the U.S. Judicial system, and you also have seen sanctions that are against the resources that the dictatorship pretends to use, that are in international banks or are reservoirs of gold and many other instruments. So I think just banning him from accessing to those resources, it's a meaningful instrument. Now, can that take him out of office? Maybe not. But those sanctions are needed.
You're sort of pinning him in a corner, right? I mean, he understands that if he were to lose office, he could be arrested. He could, by Interpol. He could. There's really no option for him other than winning the election.
As you know, Eric, I denounced him before the International Criminal Court in 2017 when I was in the Senate. And we got the support of almost 70% of the senators in Colombia. We also had support of senators from Chile. And we had the support of at that time, Senator Cast. And we were able to move that along. Now he's been investigated by the International Criminal Court, and we expect that trial to move forward pretty fast. And even though the United States is not a member of the Rome Treaty, I think the U.S., through diplomatic means with other countries in Europe, should give a message to the International Criminal Court that those investigations need to be accelerated, the trial needs to be accelerated, the sanctions needs to be imposed, because we cannot have an International Criminal Court where most of its sentences are just based on Africa, having so much evidence about all the destruction and human rights violations in Venezuela.
Now, another area where President Maduro is creating a lot of waves is on the other border with Guyana. How do you think that whole situation is going to play out with the debate about the Essequibo?
Well, I think Maduro is desperate to remain in power, and he's trying to use Guyana as an scapegoat for using the nationalistic speech. The Essequibo has been in the hands and the sovereignty of Guyana for more than 100 years. It represents almost 70% of the territory of Guyana, and Maduro has tried to threaten Guyana that he's going to take away that territory. He actually passed a bill saying that territory is part of Guyana, and that is something that is simply insane. So Guyana is requesting that the process before the ICJ keeps on going, where they have made not only a legitimate defense of their sovereignty and their interests, but I also believe that Guyana will prevail, because I think the judicial arguments that Guyana has presented before the ICJ are contended. So I believe
Maduro doesn't even recognize the legitimacy of the ICJ.
Yes, but Maduro also knows that the international community is not going to let him play the Putin card in Ukraine here in the Western Hemisphere. And there's going to be a very strong response if he tries to use force against Guyana. Not only from maybe the United States and Canada, but there's going to be a response also from Latin American countries according to the Treaty of Reciprocal Attention. So he better not play with that, because he knows that if he tries to play that card, he's going to receive a very strong response.
When it comes to borders, though, literally in recent years, a lot of international norms, Russia invading Ukraine, Iran directly confronting Israel now. Is it so hard to believe that he actually might try something as it relates to incursion into the...
I don't think he has the military capacity to invade Guyana and to sustain an invasion in Guyana. I think it will be a very stupid card, because he will have an immediate response from international community, from the Latin American countries, but also from the U.S. So I don't think he really
You think he'd be accelerating his own regime change if he were to try that?
Yes, without a doubt, without a doubt. And also, I believe that the Guyanese people have been taking very good care of the Essequibo just on a pure conservation and protection of nature scope. When you see how Guyana has been able to keep a territory with basically no deforestation, having 85% of the country in tropical forest, and being one of the leaders in the World Campaign for Nature, I think Guyana can make a very good case of a country that has been moving along an energy transition, but at the same time being one of the leaders in conservation. And the Essequibo, as you know, is a very rich place in biodiversity that Guyana has not economically exploded that region. Instead, it has been protecting it. So it will be also an environmental disaster if Maduro tries to play that hard card.
Now, you recently wrote an article about Guyana, and you talked about how, with its small population and all these immense resources, principally coming from oil and gas, but all the other foreign direct investment that's coming into the country, that it's an opportunity to treat the country almost like a laboratory for a lot of interesting ideas that have been locked away either in think tanks or in academia, and now there's an opportunity to actually put some of these ideas into action. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think Guyana today, it's a country that, as I said, is a leader in conservation. I mean, imagine 85% of the territory in tropical forest, an Amazonic country with almost zero deforestation, almost 14% of the territory in the hands of indigenous groups with legal titling, and having them the possibility to be protectors of that environment. So I think there are very important indicators. Guyana has an approach with a low carbon development strategy that has been in place for more than a decade. And it's also making a big investment out of the resources that they are making due to their offshore exploration and exploitation of oil and gas. So they're transforming their energy matrix to be no longer dependent on heavy oil. They're making investments in solar and wind, in non-conventional renewables. And they are also making a big economic change, just because they have become maybe the world's largest producer of oil per capita, but they're using those resources in order to invest in education, healthcare, housing, and human development. So it is a lab. And something that is also very important is how they can massify a universal income for those families that have been impoverished, so that they also have that support over time, while they also expand the investments in human development.
Now, what do you think about Guyana, given all this oil wealth that it has at its fingertips and the fact that it has this small population, but it's also a bit of an outlier. It's an English-speaking former British colony associated with the Caribbean, but it's on the South American landmass. But at the same token, it's kind of becoming this poster child, if you will, for what successful development might look like throughout not only the global South, but particularly in Latin America. What do you see that? Are you surprised by the way in which Guyana has sort of taken the mantle?
I think Guyana has an amazing leadership. I think President Ali is working on a development agenda that is able to give the people social solutions that they have been expecting for a long time. Obviously, the challenge he has is the speed of those transformations, but I think he is acknowledging that speed needs to be increasing day by day.
Now, we're here in Washington, D.C., and a lot of your colleagues or former colleagues from finance ministers and former heads of state are here in town because of the World Bank spring meeting. And obviously, those types of people understand some of these issues. But here, domestically in the United States, when the average American is thinking about Latin America, in most cases they're thinking about the immigration issues or issues at the border. How does Latin America elevate some of these issues that we're talking about so that they matter to the average voter, the average constituent in this country?
So there are going to be at least 4 items that are going to demonstrate the strategic importance of Latin America for the United States. 1, energy supply. Even though the U.S. has made a tremendous transformation of its energy matrix, and it has become a top exporter of oil and has reduced its dependency on foreign oil as was part of the state policy since maybe 2004 until now, the U.S. in the long term is going to require more sources of energy, and Latin America, it's almost, let me use this term, it's going to be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy in the next decade. So Latin America is going to play a strategic role in the energy transition of the Western Hemisphere, also positively impacting in the U.S. Second item, food security. Latin America has many of the world's strategic arable land, and Latin America can become a very important strategic supplier of food, where? Worldwide, obviously, but most importantly, in the Western Hemisphere. And that can be strengthened through trade agreements. Third, which is also very important, Latin America can be the most important place for friendshoring, because we have better legislation in terms of well-paid jobs, better scrutiny on corporate behavior, better scrutiny on ESG investments. We're close to market in the case of the US, so we have less transactional cost. And if Latin America becomes that engine of near and friendshoring, what is going to happen is that is going to become a deterrent of massive migration in the southern US border. So better opportunities, which will be driven by U.S. investments, taking advantage maybe of lower costs, but better possibilities in terms of environmental and social standards, it's a win-win. And fourth, is a strategic region for the U.S. long-term national security. So looking to Latin America with those perspectives should allow every single American voter and citizen to understand that Latin America as a whole is a strategic ally of the Western Hemisphere development, and it's essential in terms of food, energy, industry production, and security, the best ally of the United States of America.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Mr. President. Thank you so much for talking to Newsweek magazine.
Eric, thank you so much, and I look forward to see you in Colombia pretty soon.